Okay, you should be on page 5 of your notes. Okay, we're going to pick up, you did where you left off last week with a quick review of some of the things you should have learned already, and then we'll move on to something new. The focus today, the most important word our takeaway is going to be is the word solutions, right? What does it mean to find a solution? So this is what you should have learned last week about solutions. All right, when a problem has a square in it, like this equation does, it is going to make a U-shaped graph. Now, a U-shaped graph has a vertex, and that should always be the number one thing that you find. You want to find the vertex first, and that's got a great formula that you should always start with to help you find that vertex. So the vertex formula is x equals negative b over 2a. Now this problem contains values for a, b, and c. We just need to figure out what those values are. So let's take a look at this equation. It starts with an x squared, but what's really there is the number 1. And that is going to be what the value of a is, because a is always by the x squared term. The value of b is always going to be by the x term, and the value of c always comes last. And so the way it should normally go would be ax squared, and then bx, and then c, and then equals 0. So what we have is we have an x squared, so we need to understand that there's a 1 there. We have a minus 16, which would be back here at the end, because it doesn't have a value on it. It doesn't have an x variable on it. And then we're missing that middle term, so that means we have a 0 term there. So we really have 1x squared plus 0x minus 16, and then that's still equal to 0. So that helps us identify part A, part B, and part C of the question. Okay, this is a review, what you should have learned last week. So when we look to the formula, we're looking for what is in the position of B. So we start out with negative, and the value of B is 0. And then 2, in parentheses, we put in what the value of A is, which is 1. And so negative 0 is on the top, and a negative times a 0 is still a 0. 0 times anything is 0. And the denominator is 2. 0 divided by 2 is 0. So that is the x portion of the vertex. But we need a y portion of the vertex also. And how we get that is we take the 0 that we got and we work our way backwards, and we put that back in to the position where x was. And so then we're going to get parentheses, we're plugging in 0, and we're going to square it. And then all we have to do is minus 16. So 0 squared is 0, minus 16. 0 minus 16 is negative 16. So these two numbers, the 0 and the negative 16, give us what are called our vertex. And so we would identify our vertex as 0, comma, negative 16. That is the right way to write that vertex. You put the x number first and the y number second. And then we graph that on our graph. So 0, 16 is 0 for x, and then down 16 for y. I'm going to count by 2's. So here's the origin of 0, and then negative 2, negative 4, negative 6, negative 8, negative 10, negative 12, negative 14, negative 16. That is where the vertex goes. All right. So that is the lowest point of our graph. Then we make a table And a good table always has 5 values. So you make space for 5 values. And the vertex should always go in the middle. So 0 and -16. And we should fill in the numbers that go before and after 0. So 1 and 2, so 0, 1, 2. So 0 is not, we don't always just go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's not a good way to make a table. You always want to start with your vertex, whatever it was, in the center. And then we have 0, 1, and 2. And then going the other direction, we'll make a mirror image of that. And so we would have -1 and -2. And to fill in the rest of our table, we plug each of those numbers back in to the original formula. Okay, all of them get plugged in. So we're going to go, and with parentheses, -2 gets plugged in and square it, -16. And then -1 gets plugged in and square it with parentheses. Those parentheses make a difference. I noticed on your quiz, a lot of you were not using parentheses on your calculator, and then you end up with the wrong answer. A parentheses matters on that calculator. The way your calculators work, they require parentheses. We can drop down to 1 squared with parentheses, -16, and then 2 squared with parentheses, -16. So when we square each of those numbers, okay, we're going to get -12, -15, -15, -12. And so we can graph those values too on our graph. Remember, we're counting by 2s. So that would give me 2 dots on either side, perfectly mirror image. And then it would give me down to negative right here. Okay. Now, some of you made the mistake of thinking that this graph then had no solutions. Remember, that's the key word. That's the key takeaway from that, is that you're thinking, oh, this graph doesn't have any solutions. Let me go back and show you that we are looking for how many solutions a graph has. A solution is where your graph will eventually cross the x-axis. Just because we haven't crossed the x-axis yet doesn't mean that this graph won't eventually cross the x-axis, and it will. You just have to extend the graph far enough. It's not like this graph just stops. This graph continues. So we need to extend this graph farther. It needs to keep going because it's a U shape, and it keeps going and it ends up crossing the x-axis right there. And the other side too, if we're careful, we draw that straight up. All right, that is called a solution. Right here where it crosses the x-axis on either side, those are called the solutions to your graph. And so the solutions are those positions. Remember, we were counting our graph. Each square represented 2, so that's 2, 4. And then if we go backwards, -2, -4. So our solutions to this problem are x equals 4 and -4, because this is where our graph crossed the x-axis. That is what you should have learned how to do last week. You should have learned how to make a vertex. You should have learned how to make a table. You should have learned how to graph and how to identify where the solutions are. This is doing the solutions using graphing method. All right, that's a review from last week. Let's move on to the next one. Now, here's another question about what are the solutions. All right, so this is our keyword. What are the solutions here? So the new thing we're going to focus on today is how to find the solutions without graphing, because graphing is tedious. It's not always the easiest way to do it. It takes a long time. Sometimes there's easier methods to solve something by finding a solution. So if you could just slide your notes over just a little bit, and we're going to review how to find a solution the way maybe you learned first semester how to do it. So that maybe the question would be something like this. solve, which is another way for saying find the solution, 3x minus 75 equals 0. To solve something, it has to be equal to 0. That's how you have to start that. And then what you would do is you would work towards, maybe you would call it getting x by itself, and you would do something to both sides to help work towards canceling out the numbers that are there. So the first thing you'd want to do is add 75 to cancel out the minus 75, but you have to do it on both sides of the equation. And so then what that would give you is a canceled out here, and you'd be left with 3x, and then equals, and then on the other side you get 75. Then you want to cancel out the next thing. The next thing to get rid of would be the number 3. And so to do that, the only way you can cancel out a 3 is if you divide by 3. And then you do it on the other side also. And what that does is then that reduces the 3, and it gets you x by itself. And x is equal to what 75 divided by 3 is, which is 25. You say, great, x is by itself. That's my solution. And I'm going to put a box around it to show I'm done with my work. Okay, we're going to use that same idea to find the solution here, but I want you to look at it has an S on the end. Solutions, plural. That means that there's not just one solution, but there's going to be more solutions. So the way we tackle this is very similar. We first make sure that it's equal to 0. It always has to be equal to 0 to start. And then we look to what we would do on both sides. So my first thing would be to cancel out the 75. So I'm going to add 75 to both sides of my problem. That's going to give me 3x squared equals, and then remember that the 75 and negative 75 cancel out, and then we're left with 0 plus 75. Then I want to reduce away the 3, so I'm going to get rid of the 3 by dividing. Divide both sides by 3. What's that going to give me? So then my 3's reduce away, and I'm left with x squared equals 25. But now I'm not quite done because the x is not yet by itself. The x is by the square. And I have to think of what would cancel out a square. And so you have to think, what's the opposite of a square? And maybe you're coming up with it. Maybe those of you who it's coming to your mind really fast and you think, oh, the thing that cancels out a square is a square root. And so what I want to do is apply a square root on both sides. Now a square root asks the question, what times what makes that number? So what I end up with is x by itself, because the square and the square root cancel each other out. And then I want to know, what is the square root of 25? Is there anything that multiplied by itself would make 25? And the answer is 5. And if you're not 100% sure about that, if that didn't come to you really quickly, there is a square root button on your calculator that you could use that would tell you what that number is. However, remember there's an arrow back at the beginning, and it said, what are the solutions? The solutions should be 2 of them. And so just like when we did our parabola, we had 4 and negative 4. They are the solutions. In this way also, there are 2. The other solution is negative 5. Now, how do I know negative 5 is a solution? Well, because it does the same thing positive 5 does. If you take 5 and you square it, right? To square something, 5 squared means 5 times 5. And the answer is 25. Well, if you do the same thing to negative 5, if you take negative 5 and you square it with parentheses, that would be negative 5 times negative 5. And 2 negatives also equal 25. They both have a solution of 25. And since they both check out to be 25, then I have two solutions, plural, 5 and -5. Forgetting about the negative solution is a common mistake that math students make all the way up to calculus. All right, there are students who go from Algebra 1 to Geometry to Algebra 2, and they keep going, they get as high as they can go, and they still forget the negative sign. So hopefully you will learn this right the correct way now, and you won't make that mistake, and you'll learn how to do the right way from the beginning. All right, so let's practice that a little bit. Okay, again, the clue is that when it says solutions, there's an S on the end. That's your reminder that there are often two solutions. Now, I'm going to show you a couple times where there might not be a solution. So let's see if that ever happens. But let's work on doing our math. Let's start on letter A. All right, so we've got m squared minus 36, and it is equal to 0. That's always the first thing you want to check. Is my equation equal to 0? And if it's not, you need to make it equal to 0 first. So since this one is equal to 0, then we can show our work by adding 36 to both sides. And you always want to show what you're doing clearly to the person who's grading your homework. Either they're correcting your homework or correcting your quiz or correcting your test. You always want to show your work. So that's going to give me m squared, and the 36's cancel out, and then we're left with m squared equals 36. Now I need to apply the square root on both sides so that I can get m all by itself. So we're going to do that and then see what we get. So that means m is now by itself, and the square root of 36 is 6. But there's also a second answer to that, and that would also be -6. So I have two solutions, both 6 and -6. You can always check your answer. 6 times 6 is 36, and -6 times -6 is also positive 36. They both check out, and so we've got two solutions. All right, let's move on to part B. We want to do something to work towards getting that x squared by itself. We have to cancel out the 3. We also have to cancel out the 15. We're going to work on the 15 first. So the way to cancel that out is we subtract 15 from both sides. And then we're going to show that the 15 cancels it out, 15 and -15. That leaves me with 3x squared. And on the other side of the equal sign, 0 minus 15 is -15. The next thing I want to remove is the 3, and I do that with division. So I divide on both sides. I show that I'm dividing by 3. And I'm going to have 3 reduces with 3. And what I'm going to get then is x squared on one side, and then -15 divided by 3 is -5. Then I want to apply the square root on both sides, and I apply the square root on each side of the equation, and then we'll see what we get. And the square root of -5. So what times what would work out perfectly to be -5? Well, let's see. It's only 1 times 5. That makes 5, but those aren't the same thing. They're not identical. So maybe grab your calculator and try typing in the square root of -5. And what you'll notice is every time you try and take the square root of a negative number, you are going to get an error. The square root of a negative number does not exist. And so in this situation, we have no solution. So a lot of times there are two solutions, but in the case where you're trying to apply the square root of a negative number, that would be no solution is possible. So this problem is not possible to solve. Let's move on to letter C. We're going to find the solutions of this one. But the first thing I notice is that it's not equal to 0. It has to be equal to 0 in order for me to work towards solving for this. So if that's going to be the case, or for me to solve something equal to 0, I need to start with taking away that 16. And then I'm going to do it on the other side also. Got to do it on both of my sides. So the 16 that's in the yellow circle, that's going to cross out. And that leaves me with 16 minus 16 is 0. Now it's equal to 0. These two also cancel each other out. And so what I'm left with is only 4 and d squared. So now I've got it equal to 0. That's what I need. Now I want to get rid of the 4. So I'm going to take the 4 and I'm going to show that I'm dividing by 4, but I got to do it on the other side also. And so the top 4 and the bottom 4 reduce each other. And that would leave me with d squared by itself. And then 0 divided by 4 is still 0. Now I want to get rid of the square, so I'm going to use a square root. And I do it on both sides. That will give me d by itself. And then what happens when I square root 0? Well, we've seen a couple different situations. We've seen what happens when we square root 36. That turned into two numbers, 6 and negative 6. We saw what happened when we took the square root of a negative number. That wasn't possible. Is it possible to take the square root of 0? And the answer is yes. It is possible to take the square root of 0 because 0 is not negative. I just need two things that are going to multiply to make 0. And we get 0. But there's actually a second number, and it's negative 0. And that's something that might be brand new idea to you, that there is such thing as positive 0 and negative 0. Most teachers don't tell algebra students about that because it's really an advanced topic that you need for high-level math like pre-calculus and calculus is to understand that, but it still works because 0 times 0, one number multiply it by itself is 0, and negative 0 times negative 0, those two negatives make a positive, and that turns out to be 0 also. So that's an advanced topic that you might have. You could really impress Mrs. Graham when she comes back. Tell her that you know about 0 and negative 0, that those are two possible numbers. Some people call those double zeros. That would also be a good answer for that. We say that that's double 0. All right, let's see how this works maybe in a real-life situation. The picture of this real-life situation is an aquarium. An aquarium is 3D. But I want to start, if you'll slide over and make some space, I want to start with not a 3D object. I just want to start with a two-dimensional object. So if you've got some room over there, let's just start with a circle. A circle is a two-dimensional object. And a circle has area on the inside. And there's a formula for the area. I don't know if you've seen that before, but the area would be what's on the trapped within the boundary of a circle. And the formula for that is A equals pi r squared. Now r stands for radius, and r is kind of like if you find the center of a circle and it's sort of like the clock hand that would measure out like that. Maybe that is called r. R can go in any direction you want. R could go this direction, to the right, it could go straight down. It sort of makes like the spokes of a wheel kind of. all of these are R in all those different directions. That's what R is. So you might be asked if the area is 10, what is the radius? That might be a question, and this is a two-dimensional object, so we'll work on that. If the area is 10, well, so 10 is going to find its way into your equation for the position of A. All right, so you'll put 10 in there. So 10 equals pi r squared. And we want to cancel things out so that we can figure out what r is. So we work on it the same way we were working before. We want to cancel things out to make sure that the r gets by itself. And the first thing you want to cancel out is pi. Pi is a fancy Greek number. There's a button for it on your calculator. So we do on pi on both sides. And that pi will divide, just like a number 4 or 2 or 7. It works exactly the same. The pi in the numerator reduces the pi in the denominator. And then you'll use your calculator and you'll type in 10 for the numerator and 10 for the denominator, and pi for the denominator. So 10 divided by, and then you'll type pi in. So you should find where your pi button is on your calculator. Maybe the teacher can pause the video right now so everybody can figure out where pi is, or grab your calculator if you don't have it out yet. Figure out where the pi button is on your calculator, and then figure out how to type that in. When you type in 3 divided by pi on your calculator, you're going to get a decimal, and I want you to write down a couple of those numbers. It's 3 point, and then there's some numbers that come after that. That's 1, 8, 3, and then 0, so we can stop. And then that equals r squared. So we got rid of the pi using division. Now we want to square root on both sides so that we can cancel out the square and get r by itself. So now we're going to have to use the square root button around 3.183. So you should have your square root button and then type square root of 3.183. We get another decimal, and that's 1.784. And then we have a 0 after that, so we can stop. That is the value of the radius, 1.784, and the value of the radius is negative 1.784. There are two solutions to the radius because the radius goes in all directions. We have radius that go in positive directions. We have radius that go in negative directions. We have radius that go in all the directions. So you have multiple answers for that. So that was a two-dimensional object. Let's go over to the aquarium now. The aquarium is a three-dimensional object, and we've got some directions drawn on here. We have 3, which is going up and down. That's the height of the aquarium. And then we have the letter L, that stands for the length, and that's going across side to side. And then we have W, and that's the width of the aquarium. So we have the length, the width, and the height. So this is a fish tank aquarium. They call this a rectangular prism. And we're talking about the volume of the tank, okay? The volume of the tank being 400 cubic feet. So let's, you'll need a formula for this one also. Volume is always length times width times height. That is always the volume for anything that's shaped like this. Okay, we call it a rectangular prism, but it could be a fish tank or a shoebox or anything that is rectangular with 3 dimensions in it. Now we're getting a couple clues from the question, and it's helpful, I always feel like, kind of on the side to label what we know from the picture and what we know from the question. All right, so what we know from the picture is that the height is 3. So we can put a 3 here for our height. What we know from the question is the statement, the length is twice the width. The length is twice the width. All right, and so it's usually in math, you work your way backwards, okay? And I know in English, we read it, the length is twice the width, but we have to start with the thing that came last. The thing that came last is the width, which we know is W. So you got to start with that. If we know that the width is W, the length is twice that. So that means a 2 in front of the W, not just a 2 by itself, but twice doesn't mean 2 alone. Twice means 2W, so you've got that as your expression for length. All right, then we take our last clue from the problem, which says the volume of the tank is 420 cubic feet. So we're going to take that number 420 and it's going to go in for the volume. So let's see what we've got all together. 420 goes in for the volume. The length is going to be 2W. The width is plain W. And the height is 3. So we're looking at multiplication, where 420 is 2W times plain W times 3. That's 6. That's 2 times 3. And then the 2 W's make W squared. Now we want to solve this by doing the same kind of things to both sides that we were doing before. We want to cancel out the 6. And so we're going to cancel out the 6 by dividing. And always please show that the top 6 and the bottom 6 reduce out, leaving us with W squared. And 420 divided by 6 is 70. Then we want to use a square root on both sides. And that will give me W by itself. And then we need our calculator to figure out what the decimal for 70 turns out to be when you use a square root. So we have the square root of 70. So again, that's going to be, you'll need your calculator for some of these questions. We're going to get 8.36 repeating. 8.3, and then there's a 6, and then another 6, and then another 6. So we'll put the bar over that to show that that is repeating. Now, is it possible to have a negative in this situation? Okay, is there 8.366 and negative 8.366 repeating? Okay, well, in an aquarium situation, we don't have any negatives that we're going to measure. Okay, these are all positive numbers. So in this situation, there's only the one answer. But we do need the units on how we're going to measure what this width is. Okay, and the directions tell us the question, what is the width of the tank to the nearest tenth of a foot? So a tenth is 1 decimal place, and then we need our feet. So remember, when you round, you're going to look at the 3. That's the 1 decimal place, but you got to check the 6, and the 6 is a higher number than 5. So when we round, our answer to this, that W is going to be 8.4, not 8.3. 8.36 rounds up to 8.4, and feet is the answer. And we don't need a negative because of the word problem. Okay, last part. Suppose you have the same tank And this time the height is 4 feet and the volume is 500 feet. So we still have the same tank, which means V for volume is length times width times height. And we still have the same information, length, width, and height. And in this case, the height is now 4, because we're told that the height is 4 feet. But we still have that same twice situation, twice as long as the width. So we would have 2W and 1W. But this time we've got 500 is your volume. So you're going to put 500 in for your V. The length will be parentheses 2W. The height will be W. The width will be W, and the height will be 4. So that's going to give me 2W times 4 is 8W squared. And now we'll solve this by applying the same principles of getting rid of things or getting things by themselves. So we're going to divide by 8 on both sides, and the 8 in the numerator reduces the 8 in the denominator, leaving me with W squared by itself. And the other side turns out to be 62.5 when you take 500 and divide it by 8 on your calculator. Then you'll need to square root. The square root is going to be W by itself. And then we want to do the square root of 62.5, which is 7.906. And of course, there's the negative 7.906. But because this is still an aquarium in real life that doesn't have negative sides. So our final answer to the nearest tenth, so that means 1 decimal place, 7.9, and then since 0 came next, we can stop with 7.9, and feet is the answer, the units. All right, so that is a volume equation. In your homework, you're also going to be asked about a 2-dimensional object called just a square. Okay, or maybe you're going to be asked about a 2-dimensional object called a rectangle. And the area, you might need that formula. Okay, the area of a rectangle, which is the space that's bounded on the inside. The area of a rectangle is length times width. You might also be asked about a square and the area for that. And the area for a square is the same as the area for a rectangle. And the area is still length times width. It works for both of them, okay? But when you work out the length and the width, in a square, they're both the same. They're x and x. But when you talk about the length and the width for a rectangle, they have to be different. So you might have x for the width, but your length will be y. Or the other way around would be fine. They have to be different. So know that your area equation would turn into y times x, but for a square it would turn into x times x. So you'd have the same exact thing. All right, so you're going to be working with square roots a lot tonight. Watch out for when you have 2 answers. Watch out for when you have no answers at all, because you can't use the square root of a negative number. And watch out for when you have 1 answer, because it's a real life problem and a negative answer wouldn't make sense. Okay, so hopefully you do okay with this tonight, and then we'll move on to a new topic tomorrow.